All right. And thank you all so much for being here today. I'm really excited to be here. My name is Susanna Bartlow. I am the Community Outreach and Engagement Associate for the Minnesota Cancer Clinical Trials Network. What we do at MNCCTN is also how we're known. We bring cancer clinical trials across the state of Minnesota. So instead of folks sometimes will have to travel long distances to get that participation in a trial, we make it more available to folks across the state. And we're really, really excited and honored to be able to do that. And I am excited and honored to be here with our phenomenal speakers, Dr. Mark Juckett and Cassie Seichter. Cassie Seichter is a clinical research nurse with 16 years of experience in blood and marrow transplant nursing, 2 years of which have been devoted to managing oncology research trials at the University of Minnesota. Cassie specializes in leukemia and lymphoma research, ranging from phase 1 cellular therapy trials to phase 3 drug trials. And I know that Cassie and Dr. Juckett will be explaining more what that means in just a moment. She has previous experience as a research coordinator, finding unrelated grafts for BMT patients through the National Marrow Donor Program. And Cassie has a passion for improving the lives and outcomes of patients who have cancer, as I think many of us here do. Dr. Mark Juckett's practice is committed to caring for people with blood cancers, especially when bone marrow transplantation or cellular therapy is required. Dr. Juckett's interest in helping people with blood cancers includes efforts to improve recovery through guided survivorship. He's interested in developing survivorship care that will give patients and families the tools and support needed to regain a long, happy, and healthy life. Now, before we kick things off, I just want to share a couple ground rules for the session. The goal of the session is to help us in attendance, to help all of us feel better, more hopeful, and not so alone. We're not going to talk about specific diagnoses or treatments or give medical advice. We're not going to discuss side effect management. And we're not here to deal with practical problems like work, childcare, medical system navigation. We are excited to be here to talk to you a little bit more about clinical trials, answer those questions, and have a great conversation about that. So if you're joining us online, Emily, where's our camera? Do you know? Hello, online friends. I always like to say hi because, you know, it's such a distance we have, but it's wonderful that you all can be here to participate with us virtually. And I'm excited for you to join the conversation. If you are joining us online, our in-room moderator, Emily, is following along with your comments. So feel free to chat in supportive comments, to give an extra shout out to something that you hear or question that you hear. And please include your related questions in the chat, and we'll do our best to incorporate those into a Q&A or into the discussion as we move along. So without any further ado, I'm happy to turn it over to Cassie and to Dr. Juckett. Thank you so much.
Very good. Thank you for the introduction. Can everyone hear me? Okay, very good. So Cassie and I work very closely together in taking care of people who are on clinical trials. And so what we're hoping to be able to do today is we want to share some information, but we're hoping this will be less of a lecture and more of a discussion, because there are lots of questions about really what clinical trials are, whether people should be on clinical trials, really how does all this work? And so as we present some information, as you think about things, feel free to interrupt us. Put your hand up, we'll stop and take your questions through our presentation. Don't worry about waiting till the end. So Cassie, you want to add anything to that?
No, I think that's
good.
Good.
First of all, if you felt comfortable saying so, how many people have been on a clinical trial? Okay, actually a pretty good number. That's good. So let's go ahead and start. First of all, what is a clinical trial? So we luckily live in a world right now where the pace of innovation and new discoveries is really quick. It's amazing how quickly new things are discovered. The question is always, how do we take something that is new, something that looks promising, something that may help somebody, and first of all, find out if it really works, find out whether it's safe, and bring it to patients so that we can give this in a way that makes sense. And this is really what clinical trials is about. In other words, we're taking something that's not been proven and figuring out for sure whether it works, how it works, and what the upsides and downsides are. So if you are to join a clinical trial, that's basically what's happening. Is this is a period of discovery, figuring out, answering a question, figuring out whether something works. And what I want to describe, a question that comes up pretty routinely, is when somebody's entering a clinical trial, usually the trial will state what phase the trial is in. And so there are really 4 phases. And let me work through these. The first one is there are what are called phase 1 trials. And phase 1 trials are basically asking the question, you know, I now have a new medicine. Somebody in a laboratory maybe has discovered something exciting. They've done a lot of preliminary work in the laboratory that says this looks like this could be the next great thing. But we haven't actually given it to a person, much less a person that actually has a disease. So in a phase 1 trial, these are the trials where a new medicine or a new treatment that seems promising is actually introduced to people for the first time. And so in this type of trial, the real question is, it doesn't start with how good is it, it starts with, is it safe? Because at this point, we really don't even know what the dose is. What would be the best dose? So in a phase 1 trial, the way this works is based on the information that we have, we make some predictions about a dose that we think is safe. And in this trial, as people come in, they would receive this dose with lots of attention to anything that might be good or bad. And as a few people maybe are treated at 1 dose, if everything went well, then we might increase the dose because we're not sure where is going to be the sweet spot where we get efficacy without too many side effects. So this is really what a phase 1 trial is. In a phase 2 trial, we now have a pretty good idea that a medicine is reasonably safe at a particular dose. Usually by this time, we have some information that maybe it's helpful, but we don't really know how helpful it is. And so in a phase 2 trial, we're asking the question, well, how well does this work? Did I see a question in the back? Yeah, so the question is, in a phase 1 trial, is this done in patients that are sick or patients that are healthy? It depends on what the new medicine is. In the realm of cancer treatment, these are medicines that we wouldn't give to a healthy person because many of them are really meant to do something bad to cancer. And we don't know what side effects it might have on normal tissues. And so in these kinds of studies, we really focus on treating people who we think may derive some benefit. Any other questions at this point? Okay. So after a phase 2 trial, we have a particular medicine that now we have a pretty good understanding of what the dose is. We have an understanding that it looks like this works. It looks like this is going to be helpful. Now the question is it as helpful as what we already have? And so I already have treatments that I can give in the clinic that have already been proven to work. Is this new treatment working as well or better than what I have already? And so in a phase 3 trial, we now are comparing the new treatment with what we would typically use in a standard of care type of treatment. And so this is the place where there may be what we call randomization. So consider the coin flip. Heads, you get the new treatment. Tails, you get the old treatment. And I shouldn't use the word old. It may not be old. It may be the standard of care that we discovered a year ago. But nonetheless, it's comparing the treatment that I already have to the treatment that's new. And so this is very important because this helps us understand what really is the best treatment. At the end of this trial, we now have information that may change practice. So if the new treatment has shown that this is a better option, then this is information that, of course, is published, it's shared, it ends up in the news, and physicians will begin to adopt this treatment for the patients that they care for. And then the last treatment is a phase 4 trial, and we don't hear much about these because this is a treatment that's actually been approved. But we're always wondering, did we really capture all the long-term side effects? Did we capture rare side effects and other problems that you only learn about when lots of people are treated? And so the FDA is very interested in understanding, once you roll out a new treatment that maybe has been approved, is it really working? And unfortunately, it's not uncommon that we find out that something that had looked pretty good actually turns out to be maybe more toxic than it was in the beginning. So let me just stop there for a minute and see what questions people may have. And Cassie, I don't know if you have anything to add at this point.
Well, let's take a question first.
Go ahead. It is, and it's something that really is developed by many investigators that get involved through places like the National Institute of Health, working with the FDA and pharmaceutical companies and investigators to try to figure out what is the most logical and efficient way to take a new idea to figure out whether it's really going to be effective.
Thank you. I would like to know, on the clinical trials, are all of them published even when things don't work well? Because I have understood that sometimes they can the process of the clinical trial, and somebody else down the road comes along and repeats the clinical trial with the same kind of process, which doesn't make much sense to me.
Yeah. You're asking an important question. So there's been a tendency, we all like to publish and share positive things. There's not the same drive to share negative things. And a number of years ago, it was recognized that this is a huge problem, particularly as new medications are developed. A new medication may go through a trial and you realize this really isn't effective. And there's a tendency then not to share that information. So because of that, the NIH had taken a position that every single trial needs to be, first of all, shared in a public arena so that anybody can learn about the trial. And when the trial is completed, that information also needs to be shared, positive or negative. And the way that's done, there is a website that's your tax dollar pays for, that's available to you, called clinicaltrials.gov. And any cancer center in the US that is taking on cancer trials is required to list their clinical trial on this website. Anybody can look at it, anybody can go to it, and when the trial is completed, then the data from the trial and all the patients that participate in that trial becomes then part of the public domain so that anybody can find that information and share it. So I think this, I won't say that this has solved the problem, but it's definitely improved on the problem enormously. This particular approach is really aimed at new medications that are being studied, and most clinical trials that involve any kind of money that comes from the NIH, any kind of government money. And so certainly in larger cancer centers and places that do research, you can find all this information there, positive or negative. Yes. Okay. Okay. Yeah. Okay. No.
No, I don't think so.
It was on mute. Okay, first a question, then I'm going to give a tiny bit of background to help you provide an answer. Okay. As a patient, what questions should we be asking? What decisions should we be making to decide if we want to be in a trial? Now, the bit of background on my part, I was undergoing treatment. I agreed to be on any study I mean, I signed up for several because I knew I was getting treatment based on people prior to me. I wanted to help going forward. In my situation, things started going downhill.
Sure.
And I just said, you know, I got to focus on number one. Can we just deal with the treatment, whatever the trials might be? So I got out of it. Don't know if that's a good decision or not, but what questions should we be asking and what should help us make decisions?
Yeah. Do you want
Thank
to
you.
take
Yeah,
that?
so actually we skipped a couple of slides, but the title of this presentation is 10 questions you should ask in order to participate in a clinical trial. So one of them, or the first question you should probably ask is, what is a clinical trial? There's a lot of reasons or a lot of things that researchers are asking. So sometimes it can be a drug trial with different phases like Dr. Juckett was talking about. Sometimes it's not even a doctor who's conducting the clinical trials. There are other interdisciplinary people like nurses, social workers, all sorts of different medical people have different questions they want to ask. So it can be an interventional trial where you get a drug or some type of therapy or treatment. Sometimes they can be observational trials where they want to ask you questions or give you surveys and find out things like quality of life. How is this treatment affecting you? So there are, depending on the type of trial, you can ask somewhat different questions. Let's see, and we've gone through the phases. Could you go to the next slide, please? So a good question would be, why should you enroll in a clinical trial? Are there going to be any benefits to you? So a question you would have, or a discussion you would have with your physician or whoever is consenting you to this trial is, what would be a benefit to me to going on to this trial? What do you think I would personally get out of it? And also what is the question you're asking and what type of outcome are you looking for? What are the risks for being on that trial? Could I be harmed in any way? What would happen if something did happen on the trial? How would I be taken care of? So these are things that you want to know before you would agree to participate in a trial. And consent to a trial is it's very regulated. So there are a lot of rules and laws about how to consent somebody and what is in a consent. So this is something that should be provided to you, and you should have time to read in order to make a decision about whether you should go on a trial or not.
One thing I was going to say is going through treatment.
Yeah.
Mentally, we're kind of a mess. Don't
Yeah.
know what questions.
Yeah.
So I'm.
Good.
Yeah.
Good.
I'm kind of pulling back from when you're talking about the topic of bad news when it comes to clinical trials and how that's being more focused upon. Obviously, nobody wants to hear bad news, but when it comes to to make something efficient and work in statistics, like you have to have that data to prove it, and then also to cross-analyze so you don't have the problem twice. From a clinical, a trial standpoint, how have you seen that? Has there been negative effects in terms of how a process is on the back end so that you don't show, do you have to not show certain bad things, or is there a pressure in that way, or is it are we moving forward in an open book sense that it's let's find these things and squash it now, or you kind of get what I'm asking?
I think so. I think that so we'll go over this a little bit later as well. The history of clinical trials going back decades, wonderful discoveries, but it's not all pretty. And there's some really sort of ugly stories in the past, and ethical, questionable practices. So in the current era, with knowledge of what had happened in the past, there are a lot of safeguards to make sure that clinical trials that we have now are ethical, that there's a sense of equity, that we're providing clinical trials to anybody that may benefit, that there's oversight. And so there are many layers of oversight with any trial that we get involved with. At the local level, the immediate oversight is in our cancer center. There's a group of physicians who are not involved with the study, not just physicians. There's a group of physicians, nurses, statisticians, ethics people who review a protocol to make sure that it's scientifically sound, that the patients who get involved with this, their time, their commitment will lead to a set of data and information that is meaningful in some way. So that's the first level. The second level is every organization that does clinical trials that is at all related to the NIH has what's called the IRB, an institutional review board, that is also composed of a multidisciplinary group of people that are not involved with the research directly, but know a lot about research. This would not necessarily be physicians. It might be people from the Department of Psychiatry and people from the School of Nursing, lots of different people who then can look at the study from the point of view of a patient. So their role is to be a surrogate for a patient and make sure that everything is being done in a transparent way, in a way that makes sense and will lead to, again, information that is actionable, and that we're really covering everything that we can do to minimize the risk. So at every level, risk needs to be minimized. That's a pretty tough group of people. Yeah.
I trust doctors. I trust the process. That it's properly
Yeah, that's a good question. So we're all humans and there's always risk of bias, and we all want things to be certain ways. And so one of the ways you minimize bias is you create layers of people to look over our shoulders. Generally, it's a pretty good thing for us all to have folks looking over our shoulders and questioning when something doesn't seem right. And so I think there is oversight in a way now that I won't say eliminates, but certainly minimizes the risk for that kind of bias. And especially at the level of the IRB. Our IRB committees are put together in a very intentional and explicit way. There's a lot of oversight in how IRBs are done. And this all, we'll touch on this later, but this all follows very strong federal law that governs how all this works. And so certainly at the University of Minnesota, we have an IRB that are autonomous. They're not shy. They are very scientifically grounded, and they see their job as to protect patients. So that is their primary job. They spend a great deal of time reviewing consent forms. The downside of this process is that it's, of course, very important to put all the elements of anything that, for example, might go wrong, making sure every detail is in there, which sometimes can make these documents long. So there's a burden, I think, from a patient point of view, and there might be a relatively straightforward trial that's comparing treatment A to treatment B with a consent form that might be 20, 30 pages long. But I think the alternative of not providing all that information maybe is not ideal. And so given the state of research the way it is, I think the general idea is let's make this as transparent as we can, including making sure all this information is in there. Not only that it's in there, but that it's readable. So I think we've all tried to read a document. I can't get through 2 pages of mortgage document without falling asleep. And if anybody else is like me, it's got to, you've got to be able to read it and get through it. And so I think there's attention to that. Not that there's always places to improve, but I do think there's a lot of attention to that.
Yeah.
There's a question over there.
Thank you so much, Dr. Juckett. I do also just want to respond quickly because it's directly related. So as a community outreach and engagement associate, that's a big part of our role, is to make sure we're sort of another fail-safe written into the process, because kind of on the clinical side, it can be challenging sometimes. Doctors know what they know, but they may not necessarily know always the best way to communicate, or whether the transparency that feels transparent to us on the inside of this work is feeling transparent to people in the community. And so that's a big part of we're sort of an accountability measure for that. And I know that at least in my professional spaces around community outreach and engagement and around like health communication, there are all of these fields that are sort of expanding, because we recognize that a lot of work has been done to build and repair trust in the system. And also we can't only trust in the system, we also have to have that, you know, multi-directional communication with the community. We have to check our own biases. And so that's part of what roles like mine are in place to help do. And so I'm just putting out like a personal, like, call me, you know,
Yeah.
let me know if that's not working. And we'll see if we can put you in touch with the right person, because there are also opportunities for community members to be directly involved in things like an IRB review process and things like that. So I did just want to put that plug in there. And we have a couple questions on Stack, starting over here.
It should be on. Okay. Just kind of piggyback on that question. I was diagnosed in 1984, and my parents signed me up for the long-term follow-up study, which I'm still kind of participating in through St. Jude. And back then, I know first and foremost, a lot of it I don't remember. They did the amount of protocol on my protocol. I had 800 rads of cranial radiation, which I've heard they don't do anymore. So I just wanted to put out that almost 40 years later, I'm here, part of a trial just to help. And I continue to, just so that we can help find a cure for me personally, childhood cancer, because no parent should lose a child. And I'm very, very thankful and fortunate that I've had the parents that I have, because I know not all children have that survivorship like what I have had. And so they didn't find it. I'm from Sioux Falls. They didn't find it in Sioux Falls. It wasn't until we got up to the university that they found it. So I just want to say that I feel like I'm proof that these trials kind of work. And even though we don't know long-term effects yet, I joke that I can blend in with my middle schoolers now, because thanks to the cranial radiation and chemotherapy, I'm almost as tall as they are, if not a little bit shorter. So I can walk up behind them, and if they're saying something they shouldn't, they go, "Whoa, I didn't see you there." So, so I try and I think the one bus driver thinks I'm a student sometimes when I try and get on the bus with my student, but I just want to put out there that they may not always have their positive outcomes, but I feel like we can use, when I say the word research, we're learning. It's an education for us all. Not everything's going to work. You're not always going to ace the test. But I think, is it the Wayne Gretzky quote, you lose 100% of the shots you don't take.
Thanks for sharing that. You know, I've got a couple of comments about that. First of all, I want to point out that if you look for successes in clinical research, you don't need to look any farther than pediatric physicians who treat children with leukemia. Beginning back in the 60s, they made a very quick organization and commitment to being as focused on moving the bar in the success of treatment, so that very quickly across the nation, almost every child that went on some sort of treatment for acute leukemia was on a clinical trial. And you can follow the survival of these children and how quickly the bar moved up and improved almost year by year. It was remarkable. they continue to be probably one of the best organized groups as a whole in making sure that they're learning every step of the way with every child that goes on treatment. And so it's a testimony to that organization, and I appreciate the comment about that. There's another comment that you made that reminded me of a conversation that Cassie and I were having. You know, as physicians, we vary in our ability to communicate with patients, just like anybody else. And we've had the experience often where physicians will sit with the patients, and sometimes the patients feel like they need to audition a little bit. Everything's fine. I'm strong. I'm ready to go. And the person that gets the real story is the nurse. So I don't know if you want to share anything about that.
Yeah, the first question I usually ask after a physician is done with an appointment, I usually go in afterwards and I say, well, how was your appointment? What did you get out of that? Because a lot of times, I think physicians and medical folks in general, we talk at this level of antibodies and CAR T products and antigens and all of these very technical cellular level terms that don't always translate well into regular people speak. So I try really hard to make sure that when I speak with a patient after they've talked to a physician, that they actually know what it is we're doing and why. And I think that's a really important part about informed consent, just in general, is that you are given that 30-page document that Dr. Juckett was talking about, and it's a very overwhelming document generally. I like to go through piece by piece, make sure that you understand what it is that we're asking of you, and that you are really informed about what it is that you're going to undertake or choose to undertake. And you do always have the option to say no. So I really, I think that's one of the most important parts about being a nurse, is to make sure that as a medical team that we are serving you in the best way possible.
Okay. Was there another question before we move on? Okay.
For our Zoom friends, maybe we
Yeah, I'd rather not yell. On clinical trials over the years, and I've been part of two, not directly, but in people I've taken care of, is you'll go out to the websites and you'll find the trials, and they're pretty picky. I mean, we're only going to take you if you're this age or that age, and you can't have too many side effects going on from previous treatments. Why is that? I mean, if you're looking at a life and death situation and here's something that might really help you, that's my question.
That's a great question.
Yeah.
So there are a couple of reasons for that to happen. One reason is that if we are going to treat people with a new medicine, especially if we're not sure if it works that well, we want to make sure that we are treating a group of people who we really think are going to benefit, and not treating somebody where we think we may just do harm. And so we do want to try to orient the new treatment to the group who, aren't going to suffer undue side effects and other things like that. So there is some attempt to that. The second reason is that if you are a pharmaceutical company, and I'm just stating facts here, your job is to make money. So they need to make money. And so there is quite an effort for these types of trials to be designed in a way that will maximize the likelihood of a positive outcome. Now, the pushback on that piece is the local reviews. And so if a trial really is written that's so obviously biased, these will tend to not get through the system that we have in place. But our ability to do that, I will admit to you, is somewhat limited because there are a lot of trials that may have aspects that will favor the new treatment that are just hard to see or hard to appreciate. So I think this bias exists. is still a problem. And there's a lot written about it. So it is very much an active issue. There's a movement through the NIH to make trials, what the word they use is pragmatic. And so this is an attempt to open trials up to people, anybody that they think may benefit, and be less restrictive. And so this is an active thing that's begun. Where it goes, I don't know. But at least it's something that they recognize as a problem that you've identified, and is at least their attempt to try to begin to address it. But to put it succinctly, I think the problem that you identify remains a problem. Mm-hmm.
Hi, thank you so much. I'm a stage 4 breast cancer patient, and I had my first sort of dip into exploring clinical trials last summer when my first line of treatment, I progressed a little quicker than we expected. And I was a little shocked to understand that, there's clinicaltrials.gov, so I can go there and look at what's out there. It's obviously a lot to sift through and understand as a layperson. But to get more information or to talk to a human about any of these trials that were outside of my hospital, which most of the ones I was looking at were, I had to go there in person and become a patient and have a consult and go through a whole process. And so I went through that once at Memorial Sloan Kettering, but I didn't have the time or money to make the rounds all over the country to go to MD Anderson. So I just wonder if I'm missing something. Is there a better way to learn about things that are relevant for me, without doing the world tour each time?
Yeah, I think what you're identifying is a huge problem. There are, as you pointed out, if you go to clinical trials and look at what's going on in your particular area, it's usually not one or two things, it's 100 things. And so how do you sift through that? I don't know that there are any solutions that you're not aware of, that at least that I know of. And what, speaking as a physician, I've sat with patients and we've looked through these, and I've given them some advice on what may be an option and what's not. But in terms of this idea of needing to travel and see people, it remains a very active problem because we're not set up in a way, our medical system's not set up in a way, say that you could do just a virtual consult with the people at Sloan Kettering in your home and review all the information and have them give you then an opinion about that. We just don't have that set up. So I think that that's what we need. Maybe we'll get there at some point, but it doesn't exist right now.
Yeah, I again, as a community outreach person, and my background is not medical research so much as community organizing. And so when you ask that question, I just hear all of the questions that we work on at MNCCTN around access and what does access really mean? Mm-hmm. It does mean geography, but it also means all these other things about how much money it costs and can I really understand what's out there and all those questions. One of the things I do want to offer is that we have a nurse navigator. Penny, is it okay if you raise your So at least at the U, we have a nurse navigator line. I know I said we weren't going to talk about practical things, but it's just built in. And so one of the things that if folks are interested in questions like this, one of the things that might be useful is to look for if there's a navigator or a social worker resource. That can sometimes be somebody who can help you kind of cut through the layers. But I think it is a great question, and I just wanted to extend one more appreciation for that. I think, Dr. Juckett, we have, just as a heads up to you all, we have about 15 minutes, 20 minutes left. And then we also have one more question back here. Okay. So.
Yeah, I didn't realize that there's a cost to doing or going to some of these tests. But I also understand there's what you call a placebo group, or the ones who don't get any help at all. And so do those people at some point see as that man indicated, see their situation get worse? So maybe they assume they're in the placebo group. Can they call it quits and go and seek other help or whatever because they want to get better?
Yes. So you are allowed to withdraw from a trial at any time. There's no legal obligation for you to stay in a clinical trial. Not all clinical trials are randomized. So that's more like a phase 3 trial where you would test a standard of care or something that's already established versus an experimental product. If generally the investigator or the clinical team doesn't always know whether it is the investigational agent or the placebo. So that's one of the safeguards that they put in to make sure that the data is accurate and free of bias. But if at any time you say, you know, the side effects of this treatment are not what I'm looking for, I don't feel good, I want to do something different, your doctor is obligated to tell you what the other options for you are, and you can make a choice at any time. So you are allowed to withdraw.
And I'll add, first of all, it is unethical and illegal to give somebody a placebo on a clinical trial when they don't know it. So that cannot happen. There are many trials that are set up where the standard of care is just to observe people. And an example of that is early prostate cancer. So early prostate cancer in older men, that, you know, often the standard of care is just to watch. And so you can imagine there could be a clinical trial where you might say, well, let's try something new to see if maybe it's helpful but doesn't hurt. And if you were to do that, you might then add a placebo or sugar pill because as a physician, we're biased. And so if I know somebody's getting the right medicine and they're not getting the other one, I may look a little more carefully and other things that would make the trial not accurate. And so the sugar pill often will be introduced as a way to make sure that everyone's getting something, and then at least the physician won't bring their own bias into the situation. But if someone were to enroll in a trial like that, it has to be obvious that they know that they may, you know, flip of a coin, I might get the real medicine, I might get a sugar pill. It's simply not okay to have that happen without your knowledge. And just to emphasize the point that Cassie made, you know, a consent form is not a contract. It is permission. So you're giving permission to the medical team to treat you a particular way. And just like any permission for anything, you have the right to withhold that permission at any moment. So when you hear consent, don't think contract, think permission. That's what it's meant to be. Okay. Okay, good. Okay. So
I can talk a little about informed consent.
yeah.
So informed consent is heavily regulated by both the FDA and the Department of Human Services. There are requirements to informed consent that we as a clinical team have to adhere to very strictly. One of which is that it has to be legally effective. So you cannot consent somebody who does not have the capacity to consent. So minors don't have the capacity to consent. People who don't have the mental ability to understand or teach back the information that you give them, that would not be legally effective. There are people who maybe have like a medical power of attorney, which is different from, like, say, if you weren't able to speak for yourself because you got in a car accident and you appoint somebody in like a power, like a directive. It's not the same thing as that. So it would be somebody who is appointed by a judge to make medical decisions for you. That person could consent on your behalf, but it has to be legally effective in order for it to be a consent. It does have to be understandable. So you have to, if we explain it to you and you don't understand what it is we are asking of you, that is not okay. You have to know what we're doing and why. And we have to give you time to allow to process that information and make a decision. So say you're in an appointment and you are presented with this consent and you want time to read it and think about it, we will allow that. So you can go home, read the consent, think about it, come back in a couple of days, and then we can have this discussion again. We can do that as many times as possible for you to make that choice. And we are not allowed to do any type of study activity until consent is obtained. So no lab draws, no surveys, nothing related to the study can take place until you have consented to it. So things that should be explained to you in a consent are the purpose of the study. So what is the question we're asking? Why are we doing this? How long are you going to be on the study? Is this a 1 month treatment study? Is this a long-term follow-up study where you're on for 15 to 30 years? Is it just surveys? Is it testing? So what is it that we're doing, and how much time is it going to take for you to do this? Are you coming to the clinic every day? Are you coming once a month? Are you coming every 3 months? Does it require scans? These are all things that should be discussed with you before you sign consent. Whether or not it's randomized. So like when Dr. Juckett was talking about the phases of study, do you know specifically whether you're getting like a placebo pill or are you getting a treatment? Sometimes it depends on the study. What are the risks and benefits to you? Both things that we know about and things that we may not know about. You want to know really what you're getting into before you sign it. What are the alternatives to participation? So if you choose not to be on this clinical trial, what are the standard of care options for you? Confidentiality. So there are a lot of rules in place about your information, which we may not get to that slide because we've had a lot of questions, which is great. But HIPAA, has everybody heard of HIPAA? So it is a requirement of us to make sure that your information stays confidential. So that is a piece of the consent process that we will talk about, and how your information stays confidential. How much will it cost you? So there are unforeseen costs such as parking, transportation, time. Those are all things that are required in order to make these appointments and be on clinical trials. So that is something we should be talking to you about. The contact info for the study team. So if you have any questions about the trial, you should have the information of the person who's running the trial, and at the very minimum, the research nurse who is involved in it. How many people are involved in the study? So is the maximum amount of patients that we put on 14? Is it 500? Is it thousands? These are all questions that we should be telling you as part of the clinical consenting process. And then that voluntary portion we talked about, so that it is you can withdraw at any time. And then in many clinical trials, we ask about specimens, so blood draws, sometimes bone marrow biopsies, tissue samples, things like that. If that is part of the trial, we should be telling you where those samples go and what happens to them and how long they stay there. So those are all parts of an informed consent that should be answered before you would agree to any clinical trial.
Is that better? Okay. If anybody's interested in learning more about this, there's a book about a young woman who lived in Baltimore many years ago named Henrietta Lacks. And this is a phenomenal book. It's really well written. It talks about the good, but a lot of the unfortunate things that have occurred historically in the development of clinical trials. It covers a lot of the safeguards that were built, but it also opens up, some of the limitations that still exist. And anybody that enjoys reading about science, how science develops, I would really encourage that book. I'll just put a plug in for that.
We have some online comments and questions, if we can go through a couple of those.
Okay.
So the first is, are patient advocates part of an IRB?
I don't know the answer to that. I don't know the answer to that.
I know that I know of at least one community representative who participates in the University of Minnesota's IRB. I don't know all the details and would be happy to connect with people to find out more. But I do know that there are community representatives and experts who participate in the IRB. Patty, you look like you might know. Okay. All right. Thank you.
We will follow up with the answer to that one.
Okay.
The next one says, are the timelines for eligibility assessment and starting the clinical trial explained at the first appointment? And what are the steps taken in the assessment phase? I'm waiting on my first meeting for a trial this week, and the timeline for treatment is my biggest concern. I'm wondering what I can expect when I face a lot of pressure from continuing disease progression. To clarify this, pressure to choose my next step forward, whether it's a trial or not pressure to join the trial itself.
Do you want to answer?
Yeah, so it varies based on the trial. So it's written very specifically. Some studies have up to a month to complete all of the screening. Some have a couple of weeks, some have a couple of days. So when you go to your consult, they will talk about both a standard of care option and the clinical trial, and they will tell you how long they anticipate it would take for you to get treatment on the study. And then it would be hopefully up to you to decide whether or not you think moving on to a standard of care option or a research option would be best for you.
And I'll add to that this is an important issue because it's usually delineated what we call the screening phase, where we're doing testing to figure out whether somebody is, eligible and right for the study, whether the study makes sense. But from a physician point of view, my job is to make sure that the person in front of me is going to be okay. And so even though there may be a screening time period, I may feel differently about the time period that is okay. And so if this person has a concern about that, that's definitely a question for the medical team.
And then we have one last comment on here, but maybe you could answer it as a question and possible solution if there is one. The comment says, I know the big issue my wife and I had was when I was in a clinical trial, we did not have a quote unquote patient advocate or social worker to navigate the cancer journey. We had an excellent, capital letters, clinical trial coordinator, but we were left to our own devices in finding cancer resources. We ended up finding, in essence, everything not related to treatment: psychological assistance, live strong at the Y, financial assistance. We applied for Social Security disability income by ourselves, etc. Is there a different resource that people could turn to, or who should they be asking these questions to?
So I think they identified a problem that certainly exists. There are many, many resources, such as what's talked about here, that from a physician point of view, I may not be aware of, much less have ways of connecting people to those resources. And so this idea of a navigator is something that is a newer position that a lot of cancer centers are pulling together, that really the idea is to bridge the medical team and what other resources are out there. I will also say that one of the advantages of being on a clinical trial is usually there's a different set of people, different eyes on the situation. And the clinical trial nurses tend to be very experienced. They've been through lots of their own clinical care. They've had a lot of practice, often years and years of practice. And nurses tend to be a little better organized in sharing resources and survivorship opportunities and other things like that. And I think generally are a very good resource. So I'm glad to hear that the clinical trial nurse served that purpose here.
Well, thank you both so much. Obviously, so many more questions and discussions, but I really appreciate your expertise and your time here. And so can I just get a round of applause for Dr. Juckett and for Cassie?
Thanks for having us.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thanks.
And I know a couple times throughout the presentation, I offered to be a resource. So I'm happy to speak with anyone. I'll be here for the rest of the day. And again, my name's Susanna. And just thank you all for the thoughtful conversation and questions, for sharing your stories. For virtual attendees, Zoom friends, you will now stay in the same Zoom window and the lunchtime panel will begin shortly. And if you're in the room, feel free to take a stretch and pick up a box lunch, and then we'll be back in here for the next session. So thank you so much.